Well, good morning, church. How's everybody doing out there? Good. Mostly awake, right? Well, it is great to be together. Let me invite you to stand. And, you know, as we worship this morning, I hope this is just an enjoyable time for you. I love coming together as the church, lifting up our voices, celebrating our God and all that He is and all that He does. And if maybe singing's not your thing, maybe you just want to listen to the music, enjoy the words, but God has called us to worship with a joyful heart. And that's different for everybody. It's not going to be the same for you as it might be for me, but we can all engage our hearts in one way or another. So let's do that this morning as we thank God for His love and worship Him today. Sing, not gonna wait, not gonna wait. Wait for the walls to fall, 'cause I know a name that will bring them down. Oh, I got a praise waking within my soul, and I'm not ashamed to declare it now. Sing the light of the world, light of the world, trample the dark. Amen. God, as we gather this morning, I pray that we would just acknowledge that we would truly believe that you are the light of the world, God, that you are going to accomplish everything that you set out to. God, that you are just working in and among this place even this morning. God, that as you set the plan in place to redeem and restore us to yourself, God, that you sent your Son, Jesus Christ, God, to give his life for us after living a sinless life in our place, a life that we could not live. And so, God, this morning, as we just gather into this place as your church, God, I pray that we would just allow you to, God, let us know your love. Let us feel your love this morning as we worship you, as we give you all the honor and glory. We do it in Jesus' name. How great our God is, how worthy he is of our praise and all that he has accomplished. I believe he gave sight to the blind. I believe that the dead came to life. I believe there were wonders and signs. You're still the same. Oh, I believe every word that you said. I believe there are scars in your hand, that your goodness is good without end. You'll never change. I will tell of your wonders, sing of your grace. The God of creation knows me by name. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always, always. I believe you will come in the cloud. I believe you are here even now. In your presence I know there is power, power to save. Knows me by name. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Your mercy is mighty, age after age. All generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. You are. yesterday, now, and always. Amen. As we celebrate that faithfulness this morning, would you turn and take a minute? Just welcome somebody to New Beginnings before you sit down. Anybody's heart racing? Maybe as that can of Mountain Dew this morning. It's very possible. Too much caffeine. Well, it is great to be together, and just great to hear the voices worshiping this morning. We're going to invite the kids to head out to their class at this time. And as they do, just pray that they continue to learn of God's love. And if you're not sure where to go, maybe you're new here, would like to know where to go or have any questions, just head to the back door there. Follow the crowd, and they'll help you. There's some children's ministry workers back there, and they would love to help you out if you have any questions.
There is strength within the sorrow. There is beauty in our tears. And you meet us in our morning with a love that casts out fear. You are working in our waiting. You're sanctifying us when beyond our understanding. You're teaching us to trust, for your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. Your wisdom unimagined. Who could understand your ways? Reigning high above the heavens, reaching down in endless grace. You're the lifter of the lowly, compassionate and kind, and your promises surround me, and your promises are my delight. Your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. Let's sing that chorus one more time. Your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. You're faithful forever. You're so perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. Will you pray with me? Father God, we just thankful. We are thankful for your faithfulness to us. That your plans for us are to prosper. God, that you are for us and not against us. And you are sovereign. God, we pray that as Pastor Curtis comes to share with us, that you would open our hearts and our minds to receive from you. We welcome you in this place. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good morning. I know Brian asked you if your hearts were racing. I'm just trying to get my heart in gear. I am completely exhausted. I wasn't really double fisting 2 coffees today if you saw me carrying 2 cups. I left an old cup up front, but I did have a fresh one this morning. I just got back from a week down at Whitehall Camp and Conference Center before our annual gathering for the Western Pennsylvania churches. We get back and we, once a year, the churches, there's 60 plus churches in the state that gather for encouragement and fellowship and worship and all of that was happening. And I know that I've talked to several of the people that have come back and they are exhausted. And one group that's particularly exhausted is about 5 weeks ago, our family ministry team and a bunch of our youth found out that there wasn't going to be a kids program. And they just thought that wasn't the way that it should work. And so they said, we're going to pitch in, we're going to do this. Our 2 interns dug in their heels and just really dug into the work, along with our 2 coordinators, Chelsea and Addie and Angie, and they pulled off a kids program with the help of all of these people that you see up there. And they did this for over 200 kids down there this last week. And so, yeah. We just wanted to thank them. I'm exhausted because I was chasing my kids and only my kids. They were chasing 200 kids. And so if you see them, just get them a cup of coffee as you walk by because I'm sure they could use it. But we are really proud of the way that they stepped up and served the larger church that week. We've been in a series here that we started that's called Talking Faith. And really what we want to do over the next few weeks as we go through this series of Talking Faith is talk about what does it look like? How do we as a people have genuine conversations about our faith? Because faith is one of those deeply personal issues, right? It's one of those things that when somebody comes up and they ask you a question, it's kind of at the core of who you are, and it can feel very personal and very invasive at times. Let me ask you, have you ever had one of those questions or one of those conversations that was really uncomfortable, like you got into the middle of it and you did not enjoy it? Just me. Some of you are out there. I see a couple hands. The rest of you are going, right now, I don't enjoy this. Okay? Don't make me raise my hand on an early Sunday morning. We sometimes get into those conversations that are uncomfortable, that are difficult, because they're personal or they're something that we hold at the core of who we are. And when you get into some of those conversations, those difficult conversations, there's usually 4 different ways that we can act as we come into it. There's the idea that we can fight, that we can fly, that we can fawn, or we can freeze. And so 2 of them you might have heard of before. They've added 2 more because as they've done some study, they've realized there are some different reactions when we get into these difficult, uncomfortable situations. And so the first one is a fight, and that's the attitude of you get into this conversation and you're going to come out the winner, no matter what. And so the other person better be prepared because you're coming at them with everything you got. And you don't care what the casualties are on the other side, you're going to be the victor. The idea of fly, this is where I like to fall into. You get into those uncomfortable conversations and you quickly look for the closest escape route. You kind of imagine that there's those airplane stewardesses that are like the wings exits are located here and here, and you take it as soon as you can, and then you spend the next 5 weeks avoiding them, right? You duck behind things because you don't want to have conversations. You see them out in public. There's the idea of freezing, which is just plain possum. If you just don't move, don't talk, don't speak, they might think you're dead and they'll walk away and the conversation will stop. Or you just stare at them awkwardly until they feel uncomfortable and leave. Or there's the idea of fawning, which is the idea of making sure that they get whatever they want. And so you agree with whatever, you say whatever you need to say in order to get them content so that they walk away and leave you alone. And so you do whatever it takes to placate them so that they don't bother you. When it comes to these deeply personal conversations, we have difficulty sometimes having them because they come to the core of who we are. And these natural instincts, they kick in when it's the psychological term is when you flip your lid. It's when the front part of your brain disengages and you're just relying on some of your habits to take you and carry you through. The logical part is no longer engaged and you're just reacting. So what do we do? How do we have these genuine conversations? Last week we talked about the fact that these conversations are something that we have to be prepared for. And we looked at a passage from 1 Peter where he said we need to always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have. That it's not a question of if, it's a question of when these conversations happen. And so we started with that idea, looking at it last week, saying that what we have to do is we have to get to the place where we are more concerned about the relationship and the person than the actual conversation and the agenda, because that's what it takes to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have. But not only do we have to have an answer, we have to give it. We have to have the conversation with the proper attitude. If we go back to 1 Peter, as he is writing to the church and he is talking to them about what it means to have an answer for the hope that you have, he is explaining to them this idea in chapter 3, verse 15, about always being ready to give that answer. And yet before he gets to that, he says, let's preface it and let's make sure that we are in the right attitude, we are in the right spirit to even have the conversation. Because to be honest, sometimes when we get into those conversations, we are not. And we go to our instincts. We go to those gut-level reactions of fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And we do some damage to the relationship because we are not in the proper place with the proper attitude to have the conversation we need to have. And so as he's writing to the church in that early time in the 60s when the culture was becoming very aggressive to people who were following after Jesus, that were really questioning, why are you doing what you're doing? He tells them just a few verses before they need to be ready to have an answer. In verses 8 and 9, finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tenderhearted and keep a humble attitude. Do not repay evil for evil. Do not retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. So what Peter begins to do is he says, we need to make sure that our spirits, our personality, our attitude is in the right place before we have the conversation, before we give the answer for the hope that we have. And so he starts to tell them about what it looks like to be a person who follows after Jesus in a culture that is not so much interested in Jesus. that is maybe even aggressive towards that group. And so he's telling them this idea of, you need to be tenderhearted, you need to be humble, you need to be kind. He says, don't repay evil with evil, don't repay insult with insult. What he's really doing is when he says, don't repay evil with evil, he's quoting from Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, where Jesus was teaching to this large crowd on this hillside. And he's talking to them about what it means to be a person who lives in the kingdom of God. And he talks about this idea of not repaying evil for evil. And Peter is saying, remember what Jesus instructed. Remember the things that Jesus taught. We don't repay evil with evil. And he said, let me take it one step further. We don't even go down the fact of insults with insults. See, it's easy for us to justify it and say evil is just the actions that we commit. But Peter says it's also involving the words that we use. How we talk to people matters. And so Peter says, if you're going to be a group of people that follow after Jesus, you need to figure this out. As I was reading this past week, it reminded me of that age-old adage that you used to hear growing up maybe. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? And it's almost like Peter is saying that. But he kind of changes it a little bit because he says, if you don't have anything nice to say, then think of something nice to say. Because he said, rather than getting involved in the evil, rather than getting involved in the insults, what we're going to do is we're going to return a blessing. But I love the end of that because he says, understand, this blessing, this is a gift from God. Sometimes we read it that we give the blessing and then God gives us a blessing. But I think what Peter was hinting at here was the idea that this is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. He will give you the blessing that you need to give a blessing to someone else. To return an insult with a blessing. To not get involved in the curses and the fighting. See, he says if we're going to have genuine conversations about our faith in a world that is kind of fighting against God because the world is broken and the world is hurt, then we got to rely on God's strength to get us through it. Because sometimes it feels like this tug of war, right? Sometimes when we get into these conversations about faith, because it's personal, it kind of flips our lids, that logical section kind of disengages, and we just go into our gut reaction of either ignoring the person or fighting the person or saying whatever the person wants to hear to make them happy or just plain dead. We go into that gut reaction, and yet what Peter is saying is that there's this, it's almost like a balancing act. And sometimes we might feel that tension as a person who follows after Jesus. Do we speak the truth or do we speak love? Because you've heard different people say different things in this world, right? Some people are saying you just need to love them, you just need to love them, you just need to love them. And then you have other people saying you need to tell them the truth, you need to tell them the truth. And sometimes we're caught on this tightrope where we feel like we have to walk this fine line of we can't go too far this way, we can't go too far this way. How do we actually manage this? How do we survive? What is the attitude that we need in order to accomplish these conversations? I want to let you know this isn't the first time the church has had to deal with this. This isn't the first time that this has been addressed. And what we find as we look through all of the different teachings and all the different scriptures is that the idea of the attitude with how we have the conversation is just as important as the words that we have for the answer. So just as important as having the answer for the hope that we have is the way in which we share it. I want us to look at a letter that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. And we're going to look at chapter 13. But 1 Corinthians is this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. The church in Corinth was struggling because the church in Corinth was excited about Jesus. It was excited about all the different things that they had heard. But what they were doing is they were using these things to create kind of these levels of classifications, and they were using them to push other people down, to kind of lift other people up. They weren't acting as one body. They weren't acting as one unit. They were fighting each other. They were struggling with what does it mean to be a group of people that are following after God together in this world, and what does it look like to live this out so that other people can see how this actually works. And so Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians, and it's almost a letter where it's apparent scolding a child, where he's looking at it saying, okay, you're doing this, stop it. You're doing this, stop it. You're doing this, stop it. And so that's how 1 Corinthians kind of reads, as this corrective letter saying, you guys need to look at how you're treating other people because you're messing up the message of Jesus. You're messing up the ministry of what he came here to do. And so right before chapter 13 and chapter 12, Paul, he's explaining to them this idea of what it looks like to work together as a body, to be in unity, to be one person. And he's using the imagery of a body because he wants the people to understand that we are all part of one group that is working together, that God has placed us in different ways to accomplish the mission that he has, that he is the head and we are the members of the body. There's different gifting that God has used to accomplish what he is looking for. And he's explaining it in the image of a body because it's the idea that if you cut off the foot and you take it away from the body, it's not going to thrive by itself. It's probably going to struggle and it's going to perish. Feet are not made to be on their own. The body itself can continue to operate, but guess what? It's not going to operate like it was built to. And so Paul is explaining to him, the foot needs the body and the body needs the foot. We all have to be in this together. We're all working together. We're all trying to accomplish this mission. And so he's talking to him about what it means to be a group of people that work together to accomplish the mission. And you turn the page to chapter 13, and he says, let's talk about the attitude we have while we do this. And so he starts in chapter 13, verse 1. He says, if I could speak in the languages of earth and of angels, but didn't love others, I would be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all the knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains but didn't love others, I would have nothing. If I gave everything I had to the poor and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. But if I didn't love others, I have gained nothing. So Paul starts this chapter by just kind of going, what is the point? What is the attitude with which we need to go in to this serving and this unity and these conversations? And he starts by saying, if I was the most eloquent and gifted speaker in the world, if I could make arguments that were absolutely amazing, that not only the knowledge of humans, but it was the knowledge of heaven, if I could just argue the best in the world, but I didn't love others, he says, I'm nothing more than a clanging cymbal. Have any of you ever been to a local high school game where they have the band sitting in the bleachers and you've sat right in front of the cymbal player? Not the best seat in the house, right? Luckily, they only kind of crash every once in a while. Can you imagine if it was constant? He's saying that a person who could be the most eloquent speaker in the world, a person that had the most amazing gifting, that could understand everything in the world, a person that sacrificed everything they had, if they didn't have love, it's like having a conversation with a person that is just this loud clanging cymbal, that's all you hear. Let me tell you, that would give me a headache within just a few moments. I would be figuring a way out of that conversation. And yet the reality is, if I look through social media, what I find sometimes is a bunch of clanging cymbals, right? How many of you have that friend on your social media list that you see it and all you hear is a clanging cymbal and you just keep scrolling, right? They might have the knowledge, they might have the argument, they might have the witty saying, they might have all that. You don't even want to hear it because it's just noise. Because the attitude with which the information is presented matters. It's important. That's why we talked last week about the idea of relationship, and we have to start in relationship, because it's in relationship that we can develop the right attitude. And what Paul is saying the right attitude is he's saying it has to start in love. He talked all about all this amazing gifting, the way the body is shaped, the way the body is organized. He talked about all these different ideas, and yet he turns the page and he says, you can have all of that put together in your church, but if you don't love other people, your church is just an annoying sound to everybody else around. It's not appealing at all. It doesn't accomplish what God wanted it to accomplish. It matters, the attitude. And so Paul goes into this beautiful picture following these 3 verses where he says that it is important, the attitude with which you have. And he says, so what is love? And he goes on to describe it. It's patient. It's kind. It doesn't keep a record of wrong. He lists all these amazing different things. All of them happen inside of relationship. And he gets to the end and he says, let me tell you this story, that at the end of time, when everything's done, when everything's over, he says, when you get to the end, the trophies won't matter. The accolades won't matter. The amount of arguments that you've won on Facebook or on Twitter or on any of those platforms or in any public forum, it doesn't matter. All of that will fade away. The only thing that's left is faith, hope, and love. And he says, and the greatest, the most important, the one that ties it all together is love. As he's saying this, all I can picture is Jesus, because Jesus, time and time again, as he was teaching his disciples, kept emphasizing this idea. He kept going back to this idea. He talked to them about a lot of different things. He taught them a lot of different things. He said, you're going to make disciples, and you're going to teach them to obey my commands. You're going to do this. You're going to live in a world, and he made a promise that in this world you will have trouble. That's a promise I would like to give back. But he said, they hated me, they will hate you. Okay, that's not so encouraging. But time and time again, he circled back to one idea. And he was telling them in the book of John, just before he was arrested, he said, do you know how they're going to know you're my disciples? I think we get this wrong sometimes, right? I think we forget this verse. Because sometimes we think they're going to know we're our disciples, or we're his disciples, by where we show up on a Sunday, by what we stand for, by what we stand against. No, he said, they're going to know you're my disciples by the love you show each other, because it's so radically different than the way this broken world operates. It's what drives people to ask the question of, why do you have the hope that you have? Jesus, when he was asked to summarize all of the Old Testament, and they said, what's the greatest command? It came down to 2 things, right? Love God and love your neighbor. He said those 2 are the most important. That is what everything else is hinged on. And so if you don't get this right, the rest of it doesn't matter. It's just a clanging gong, right? And I love that the people, because we as people, we're always looking for our out, right? And I love that Jesus, they ask him, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, love God and love your neighbor. And us as people, we're going, okay, well, let's see. Can we put a qualifier on that? Who is our neighbor? Okay, what are you talking about here? You know. And Jesus goes into this beautiful parable of the Good Samaritan that we read and we look at and we go, isn't that amazing? Because you read about this guy who sacrificed everything to help this person that was hurting, who sacrificed his money and his time and his effort to take care of this person. When you read it through their lens. When you actually understand what was happening in the culture, this group of people, they said, okay, who do we actually have to love? Who is our neighbor? Who are we required to show love towards? Jesus decides to pick the one that they would despise the most. He decided to pick the one that would irritate them the greatest. The one that they looked at and they said, there is no way on God's earth that he or she can be right. They just need to be tossed aside. And he said, that's your neighbor. He said, that is who you love. And when you do that, when you love each other and you love those around you, people are going to step back and they're going to say, something is different. Even Peter, as he's writing this letter to the church in chapter 3, and he's talking to them about always being ready and being humble and being tenderhearted, he gets to a place where he says, when they see the things you do, they're not going to be able to stand against you. They're not going to be able to talk against you because it looks foolish. Why? Because when it is coming from an attitude of love, it makes all the difference. So what role does truth play in all of this? Well, I want us to look at another letter that Paul wrote, and this letter comes from the book of Ephesians. So the church in Ephesus is a little bit different than the church in Corinth, because the church in Ephesus was made up of a group of people that were really following after God with everything they had. And so rather than a book that was written to chastise them against all the different things they were getting wrong, this book was written to encourage them, saying, you're doing this, keep doing it. You're doing this, keep doing it. You're doing this, keep doing it. And Paul writes this letter to them, and he even gets to a place where he decides to go over the same exact idea that he covered with the Corinthians, he covers with them. Why? Because it matters for both groups. It matters for all groups, the ones that are getting things wrong and the ones that are getting things right. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul starts writing to the church. He says, therefore, I, a prisoner of the Lord, I am begging you, I am pleading with you. Remember, he is writing this from prison in Rome at this time. He's saying, I am begging you to lead a life worthy of your calling. Circle that phrase. He said, this is where it has to start. This is where it has to begin. If you're going to have genuine conversations about faith, if you're going to be able to talk to others, if we're going to be able to answer the question for the hope that we have, then we have to lead a life that reflects that hope. Because nothing destroys a person's ability to talk about the answer for the hope that they have more than leading a life that's the opposite of the answer. And so Paul, writing to them, he says, lead a life worthy. I'm begging you. Saying my one wish, my one desire. If I could wave a wand and do anything, this is what it would be, that you would lead a life worthy of your calling. For you have been called by God. What does that look like? Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love. Making allowances for each other's faults. This last week, I kept going over that and thinking about that. What does that mean? What does that look like? Some translations say forbear one another. They all have this different idea. What does it look like to make allowances for each other's faults? I read this book several years ago that was called Crucial Conversations. And in this book, it talks about this idea of when you get into these difficult conversations, what happens is as we start to share our stories, in our heads, we start to tell ourselves a story that exists behind whatever action or whatever information is being added to the conversation. So, for example, let's say that you're planning a barbecue and your brother-in-law doesn't show up, okay? It's easy for us to start kind of stewing on that, and we start telling ourselves a story. Well, he just doesn't care. You know, he's never liked me. He always tries to figure out ways to get in the way. He always tries to, and we start going down this path where we tell this story. that we don't even know if that story's true. But it becomes our truth, it becomes our reality, and it begins to color how we interact with them from then on. What Paul is writing here is he says, make allowances. What he's saying is, tell yourself a different story. When things happen in my life, when I get into difficult conversations, when I get to a place where something or someone irritates me, not always because I'm not perfect, but every once in a while I will step back and I will actually say to myself, tell yourself a different story. Some of my friends say I like to play the devil's advocate, but I honestly think that's what Paul's suggesting here. To say, okay, well then maybe instead of just the fact that they are hateful and they don't like me and they're always trying to figure out a way to ruin my day, I tell myself a different story. They had a hard time at work. They laid down because they were exhausted. They overslept. It had nothing to do with me at all. When you tell yourself a different story, it makes it possible for us to allow things, make allowances for people to be broken and hurting in this world because they too are on a journey towards healing and restoration. And so Paul says, make allowances for each other because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. For there is one body, one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious hope in the Father. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and in all and living through all. Basically what he does there is he says, this is why we do this, because we are one. There is one goal. There is one kingdom. There is one God. There's one Savior that is working to reconcile the world. And so he reminds them of the unity we have. He goes on in that chapter to then begin explaining gifting and serving and how God shapes and puts us all together so that all of this can happen. And he gets towards the end in chapter 4, verse 14, and he says, so what happens when the body is working together? What happens when we come at it with the right attitude? What happens when everything is firing on all the cylinders? He says, then you will no longer be like immature children. You won't be tossed and blown around by every wind of new teaching. You won't be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like truth. I love that just picture, that phrase, because what he's doing is he's saying that is how the enemy works. That is how he functions. Go back to Genesis chapter 3, and you see this snake in this garden that comes up to Eve, and he's talking to Eve, and he tells her something that is so close to the truth that it sounds like truth. Did God really say, if you eat it, you will be like God? He says something that sounds so close to the truth that we get enticed by it. Paul says, when you are living in the attitude of love, when you are living in the gifting that God has given you, when everything is firing on all the cylinders and you have the proper attitude, what happens is truth becomes a natural byproduct. You are no longer caught in the waves and tossed back and forth. James talks about being tossed in the waves as well. This idea of being pushed and pulled and drug around by every single idea that comes out. He says, when you are living in this love, when your attitude is correct, truth is a part of it. Instead, he says, we will speak the truth in love. When we have the right attitude, we will actually speak the truth in love. We don't just throw the truth out and say it's all about loving people. That isn't love. Jesus said that he is love, and Jesus said that he is truth. And so real truth can't happen outside of love, and real love can't happen without truth. It's not a balancing act. They are one and the same. But Paul says the first thing we have to do is get our attitude in the right place, because we are fallen and broken and we need to follow after God's heart. And when we do that, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of the body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly as each part has its own special work. It helps the other parts to grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. So what we see is that when it comes to having genuine conversations about faith, it's not a balancing act. It's not that we need 20% love and 80% truth, or we need 40% truth and 60% love. What we see time and time again as we look at Jesus, as we look at Paul, as we look at Peter, is that we need 100% truth and 100% love. That we get that attitude of love in place where we realize that the people that we are having this conversation with are people that Jesus created, that God created in his image, that he came and died for, that he desperately wants to have a relationship with. We get that love to envelop our attitude so that we will speak the truth and share with them what Jesus is doing, why we have the hope that we have. And so if we're going to be a people that have genuine conversations about our faith, we need to make sure that our attitude is in the right place. We need to make sure that we are reminding ourselves constantly to press into God, to get his strength, to get his grace, to get his mercy, so that we can experience his love and share that with the world around us. I'm going to ask the ushers to come forward at this time. If you guys will pray with me. God, I think about this and I realize that responding in love is difficult for us in our broken, fallen state. That the fleshly desires that we talked about last week, the selfishness that we have to put to death on the cross to have the relationships with people, that desire gets in the way of us actually expressing the love that you have for all of creation. God, help us not to pervert it or twist it. Help us not to just go to a place where we say, well, all we have to do is love. Well, yes, that's part of it. But God, you want us to have the answer for the hope that we have. You want us to speak the truth as well. But you don't want us to just go around bashing people. You didn't even do that. You came to seek the hurting and the broken and the lost. You came to bind up the wounded, to reconcile the world. You came so that we would know what it truly means to be loved. God, may we make sure that our attitude is in the right place. That as we worship you through our giving of gifts, through our singing, through our lives, the way that we live, that we would live a life worthy of your calling. God, help us not to be clanging cymbals, but help us to be so different from this world that they can't help but come and ask us, why do you have the hope that you have? We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amazing love that welcomes me, the kindness of mercy that bought with blood wholeheartedly my soul undeserving. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so the cross, age to age, and hour by hour. The dead are raised, the sinners saved, the work of your power. God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Let's stand together and sing that again. Oh God, you're so good. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so good to me. And I am blessed, I am called, I am healed, I am whole.
I am saved in
Jesus' name, highly favored, anointed, filled with your power for the glory of Jesus' name. I am blessed, I am called, I am healed, I am whole, I am saved in Jesus' name, highly favored, anointed, filled with your power for the glory of Jesus' name. And should this life bring suffering, Lord, I will remember what Calvary has bought for me, both now and forever. God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Sing that again. Oh God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Yes, God, you're
about you, but I don't want to end that. You can be seated for just a moment. A couple of these announcements are in your bulletin, and I just want to bring your attention to them. First is that we're having a baptism at the pond. It'll be next Sunday, July 30th. It'll be following our second service here at noon. Would like to be baptized, you want to take that next step, you can go to our website and go under events, and you can register there, or you can call the church office or sign on your Connect card. We'd love to be able to baptize you. Second thing is church at the pond, or church at the farm. We could have church at the pond. We could have church there too. But I think we're just going to go over to the Crawford County Fairgrounds over there, and August 20th at 9 a.m. You go in gate 6, and that's at the Youth Show Arena. And always a wonderful service. Curtis always talks about being in the sawdust and, the steel chairs and being uncomfortable, but just ignore him. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And so invite people, invite friends. It's a great, great time. And then lastly, this is not in your bulletin. If you are interested in giving online, if you go to our website, there's a tab at the top that says Give. And you can set it up to give automatically each week, each month, however you would like. And if you have any questions with that, you can call me. And you can write this down. My extension is 335. Call the church office, extension 335, and I can help walk you through that if you'd like to be a part of it. We kicked it off this spring, and it's been phenomenal. I know, I love it. It's one more thing I don't have to think about, because look at me, I have to have sticky notes for everything. So one more thing I don't have to think about. I hope the message spoke to you this morning, and I hope this last song, I wrote it down, I had to write it down. We go out, and the power of Jesus is with us. So as we leave this work, take the power of Jesus with you, and love in truth. And have a great week.